So he says, وَجَازَ أن ينظر من مخطوبتي. It's allowed. Jaza means it's يجوز. It's allowed to look at a makhtuba, to look at a potential. So we're going to say a makhtuba is we're going to call that a potential. So before marrying a sister, it's allowed for a brother to look at the sister. Now, to what extent is that allowed? Let's get into that, inshallah. Now, keep in mind, it's interesting. He says wajaza, meaning it's allowed. Most of the Hanbali books agree that it is allowed. That's the hukum. But it seems that one of the only Hanbali books that I've come across, or from the famous ones, that mention another hukum is al-iqna'. Al-iqna' mentions yasunnu, means it's a sunnah. They see it, or in other words, it's mustahab to look for a brother to look at his potential. But the majority of the Hanbali, and that's the madhab is that it's allowed and not necessarily sunnah or mustahab. And when we say sunnah in the context of fiqh, what we mean by that is recommended or mustahab. Now, so it's allowed, meaning he can marry her without, and it's not necessarily recommended for him to look at her. It's just allowed. Of course, there's evidence for this. We have, for example, the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he mentions that he says إذا خاطب أحدكم المرأة فإن استطاع أن ينظر منها إلى ما يدعوه إلى نكاحها فليفعل. رواه أحمد وأبو داود. The Prophet says, as narrated by Ahmad and Abu Dawud, that if one of you propose to a woman, if he is able to look at whatever he can, and we're going to get to what this means, if he is able to look at whatever he can that encourages him to marry her, then he should do so. This is hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Not to mention that there's Sahaba who have done this. For example, Jabir, he said that, Jabir from the Sahaba mentioned that he wanted to marry a woman from the tribe of Banu Salama. So he followed her around to look at her and to see what she looks like. And we're going to get to we're going to get to some of those details very shortly, inshallah. So he says, so we know it's allowed for brothers to look at a potential. But then he specifies, and he says, مَا كَانَ ظَاهِرًا بِدُونِ خَلْوَتِ. مَا كَانَ ظَاهِرًا بِدُونِ خَلْوَتِ. What is clear and apparent from her without khalwa, without being alone with her. Now, here the Shaykh, he mentions the shurut of looking at a potential. But he doesn't mention all of them, and this is the point of a nadhm. This is the point of a nadhm. A nadhm, it's easy to memorize, and it's very mukhtasar, very summarized, but you can't mention everything, or it's very difficult to mention everything, especially if you want to make it as short as possible for it to be easier. Which is why many poems of fiqh, they're like thousands and thousands of verses, the ones who go into more detail. So here he mentions two shurut, two conditions of looking at a potential, but he doesn't mention all of them. So let's go through the shurut one by one. Number one, and this was not mentioned here. According to the Hanabila, from the conditions of a man looking at a potential is that he thinks there is a high probability that she or her family will accept. Meaning that if he thinks it's a very low probability, then he shouldn't even be looking at her, because he's just wasting his time, maybe even creating shahwa, desire, and fitna for himself, and it's not going to go anywhere. So the first condition is that he should think that there's a big chance, and that all the factors and the context and everything goes in line with the idea that there's a high chance that she will say yes, or that her family will accept. Now, number two is what he mentions here. Makana zahira. He's allowed to look at what is apparent of her. And what does this mean? Here the ulama have differed in general. The Hanabila, they say this refers to four things. What you're allowed to look at, what is meant by the apparent, the zahir, or what they call in the books of fiqh, or they say is ma yadharu minha ghaliban. What her general appearance, what does this mean? Four things. Number one, the face. So it's allowed to look at the face. Number two, the neck. So it's allowed to look at the neck. And why do they mean that this is from the things that are apparent? Because if she like bends down, does work, she moves around, you might see parts of her neck. Her hijab might uncover parts of her neck. So that's not uncommon. Number two, wal yad. Or sorry, number three, the yad, the hands, and number four, the feet. These are, and anything more than that is not allowed according to the Hanabila. Keeping in mind that most of the ulama are stricter than the Hanabila on this point. Many ulama, they say, and maybe even a majority from the madhahib, Maliki, Shafi'i, and so on, they say you can only look at her hands and face. And then you have the Zahiriyya who say you can even look at more. They even go further than the Hanabila. And others such as Al-Imam Al-Awza'i and so on, they're a lot more liberal on this issue, but those are minority opinions. And keep in mind, there is a narration of Al-Imam Ahmed that you're allowed to see the hair. But this narration seems a little bit obscure. It's definitely not the position of the madhab. So this right here is the position of the madhab. And this is really what it goes down to, because the Prophet ﷺ in the hadith says you should look at her what calls you or what encourages you, what makes you know that you want to marry her. Now this is kind of open to interpretation, which is why the Zahiri madhab, for example, is much more liberal. But it seems that many of the ulama, or at least that Imam Ahmed understood this to be these four things that we mentioned. And these are the narrations in general from Imam Ahmed. So that's the third, that's the second, condition. Number three, what is mentioned here, the condition that is mentioned here, أن يكون بلا خلوة, بدون خلوة. So khalwa means isolation. So you're not allowed to be isolated with a sister for you to look at her. If you look at her, it's either in public with people around, or it's with her wali and so on and so forth, or with her family members. At least there has to be a third party to break the isolation, because the Prophet said that, I'm paraphrasing the hadith, that when a man and a woman are together alone, the third is shaitan. So a third party breaks the khalwa, breaks the isolation. Number 4, and this is the last shart, that the one who does so should not fear falling into, or should not fear overflowing of shahwa. So this depends on the person. Somebody knows that by looking at his potential, this is going to cause him problems shahwa-wise, in terms of desires and so on, and that it's going to be a fitna for him, then it's not recommended, and possibly not permissible, depending on the circumstance, to look at his potential. Also, the books mention that if for whatever reason the brother cannot look at his potential, maybe it's hard for him to do so for whatever reason, that he can send a woman that is trustworthy to describe her for him, if he's, for whatever reason, he's not able to look at her. So that is allowed as well. Also, there's the question of, do you need permission of the sister to look at her? And in general, the ulama mentioned that there isn't really no evidence to say that you need permission, because Jabir looked at his potential in public, and he did not ask for her permission to do so. So once again, from the point of view that you're only really seeing what she displays publicly in general, then from that point of view, it's allowed for you to look at her without her permission as well. And the Prophet in the hadith did not really mention anything about asking for her permission and so on, or that permission is a shart. So that's really mainly it. Now, Sheikh Al-Qu'ayni, who is a very famous Hanbali scholar right now in Saudi Arabia, he has a mas'ala called, what's the hukum of looking at a picture of your potential? And he mentions that, obviously this to a certain extent can go back to the khilaf on pictures. But if we assume that pictures to whatever extent are permissible, or to that extent that is permissible to that extent, then he says it's allowed, based on the fact that if you can send a female or a woman to look at her and describe her for you, and if you're allowed to look at her in public without her permission, then any picture that has been taken, of her that she has released and so on, that only shows basically what you're allowed to see. Then in that from that perspective, it's allowed now. So definitely it's allowed, but with these conditions as well that really go back to everything that we've mentioned here already.